Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Herbert Hoover, and the focus is the leader of the opposition, part 1. The year is 1932, and Herbert Hoover has just lost his re-election bid to Franklin Roosevelt. He's got 4 months left as President of the United States in what turned out to be probably the second most dangerous interregnum in American history. The most dangerous was back in 1860-61 when James Buchanan was getting ready to hand the presidency to Abraham Lincoln, and during that interregnum, 7 states seceded from the Union. This time, it's an economic peril facing the United States with both foreign and domestic economic challenges, and Herbert Hoover was trying to get Roosevelt to perhaps engage. But one of the things that Lincoln and Roosevelt both had in common during their interregnums is that they both stayed silent. Back in 1860-61, Lincoln would not engage in anything going on, including secession, until he took his oath of office. Franklin Roosevelt coming into the interregnum with a very similar thought. Now, the problem was that was creating a vacuum for the American people because no one was really listening to Herbert Hoover anymore. Congress was looking to some kind of signal from Roosevelt about which way to go. That uncertainty, because Roosevelt was being quiet, was creating panic in the economic marketplace. The most immediate risk for the United States did emanate from Europe. The previous year, Hoover had issued a 1-year moratorium on debt repayment. So Britain and France just got a year off from paying back the United States on the ongoing loans dating back to World War I. But the next payments were due on December the 15th, and those foreign countries wanted to know, what are you going to do, United States? Are you going to extend that moratorium? Are you going to enforce payments? Are you going to cancel the debts, renegotiate? Well, Hoover didn't want to do anything without Roosevelt weighing in. After all, this was going to be his responsibility going forward, so he reached out to the president-elect, kind of unprecedented fashion for the incumbent to reach out to his successor to discuss policy during the interregnum, but they did meet at the White House, what Roosevelt called an informal meeting, because again, he is not in power, but they did meet on November the 22nd. Just 4 people in the room. For Hoover, he had Ogden Mills with him, his new Secretary of the Treasury, who had taken over the year before for Andrew Mellon. For the president-elect, it was Roosevelt and Ray Moley. Moley was one of his brain-trusting New Dealers who had helped come up with many of these new economic policies, a professor from Columbia, and would become part of the administration. So the 4 of them were there, they talked things through, and in the end, Roosevelt said, look, I'm just not going to engage on this. He told the press afterward, that's not my baby. And by that he meant, again, he was not planning to engage. Once again, though, this was creating that vacuum that Herbert Hoover was so nervous about. Uncertainty leading to panic. Gold started flowing out of the United States. There was a run on U.S. banks, particularly starting in January of 1933. Hoarding was going on. People were taking their money out of banks and frankly holding on to it because they were afraid that if banks go under, they might lose all of their savings. So again, this fear leading to panic, leading to inaction in the economy because the banks won't loan any money, credit is freezing up, and banks started to fail. And a domino effect, one after another. By February the 17th, Hoover is kind of desperate. He writes a personal handwritten letter to Franklin Roosevelt, once again trying to get him to engage. In this letter, Hoover said it would steady the country greatly if there could be prompt assurance that there will be no tampering of inflation of the currency, that the budget will be unquestionably balanced even if further taxation is necessary, that the government credit will be maintained by refusal to exhaust it in the issue of securities. But the problem was Roosevelt, again, refused to engage. He did respond a few days later with a letter, but he basically said, until I take my oath of office, I'm not going to weigh in on this. And that vacuum, again, was creating this problem. As Hoover said in a letter to Senator Simon Fest, today we are on the verge of financial panic and chaos. Fear for the policies of the new administration has gripped the country. People don't await events, they act. Hoarding of currency and of gold has risen to a point never before known. Banks are suspending, not only in isolated instances, but in one case in an entire state. It is this fear that now dominates the national situation. That state was the state of Michigan. They shut down all their banks for fear that they would all go insolvent. Other states were taking similar actions as thousands of banks, literally thousands of banks, closed their doors for good in January and February of 1933. There was some talk that reached Hoover that some of this might actually be intentional on the part of the president-elect. Maybe Roosevelt just wanted things to bottom out on somebody else's watch so that it would be more of an opportunity for him to get the upside once he took office. Later on, Hoover heard this from Ray Moley directly, and during the Interregnum, he heard from a mutual friend from Rex Tugwell, another of the brain trust of the New Dealers, who basically said the same thing, that FDR knew what was going on. He was refusing to engage in part because if it was going to bottom out, he wanted that to happen on someone else's watch. And again, Hoover couldn't understand this. He said that when I consider this statement of Professor Tugwell's in connection with the recommendations we've made to the incoming administration, I can say emphatically that he breathes with infamous politics devoid of every atom of patriotism. The bottom was indeed dropping out on the economy. It was one of the lowest moments of the Great Depression as the Interregnum finally came to an end on March the 4th of 1933. You can imagine kind of a chilly reception between the president and the president-elect as they did get together at the White House. They rode together to the Capitol for the transfer of power, but they barely spoke to each other. Roosevelt then took his oath of office. He gave his inaugural address. He launched the New Deal officially. He then announced when he took office a national bank holiday. He shut down all the banks across the country to try to give some calm to the panic and let things settle down before he reopened them. Hoover thought all of that was completely unnecessary. If Roosevelt had just engaged with him during the Interregnum, that could have been avoided. But that's not the way it played out. After leaving Washington, D.C., Hoover actually went with his son Allan to New York for a few days, while Lou went with Herbert Jr. directly back to California. Hoover and Allan joined them a little bit later. He planned to stay quiet. The country had spoken. He was going to let the new president kind of take over, but he was seething over these first 100 days of the Roosevelt presidency as the New Deal legislation was taking the country in a direction that, again, was anathema to Herbert Hoover and something that he had fought about during the campaign. And again, he was seething about here now that Roosevelt was putting things in place. For example, the AAA, the Agriculture Adjustment Administration. What did this do? They basically took over, this is for the agricultural section of the country, to fix prices, to enable to fix prices. What did they have to do? The government wanted to reduce supply. So the government started paying farmers to not only produce less, but to destroy crops that already existed, to slaughter excess little pigs, because if you take them out of the market, then demand will still be there, supply is lower, and prices will go up. Maybe this will help fix the economy. Herbert Hoover was appalled at this intrusion of the federal government into the American economy. He said that fascism came to agriculture by way of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This act and supplemental acts and their consequences of products and markets set up an uncanny Americanized parallel of control with the agricultural regime of Mussolini and Hitler. According to Hoover, that FDR was abandoning American individualism, American tradition, creating this massive bureaucracy that was going to lead to inefficiency and corruption. This was wrong on every level. This was the New Deal and the new direction of the country. The next step for FDR was to withdraw his support from that World Economic Conference planned for Europe. Initially, he signaled to some of those prime ministers that he would be in favor of participating and helping other countries maybe get back on the gold standard. After his team had arrived in Europe, he actually changed his mind. He cabled new instructions, no commitment to the gold standard. Basically, the conference came to an end. His team came home, and pretty quickly he took the United States off the gold standard and he devalued the US dollar. This was good for debtors, it was terrible for lenders, and it really helped to destabilize the world economy all the more. Now, that was not really FDR's concern. He made it clear he didn't really care much about the world economy. He cared about the US economy, and if that was to manage the currency, was going to be able to make things better, he was perfectly happy to do that. The way that they managed the currency would have been frightening, though, to people like Herbert Hoover and many in the country. This is according to Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury for Roosevelt. The actual price of gold on any given day made little difference. Our object was simply to keep the trend gradually upward. hoping that commodity prices would follow. One day, when I must have come in more than usually worried about the state of the world, we were planning an increase from 19 to 22 cents. Roosevelt took one look at me and suggested a rise of 21 cents. It's a lucky number, the president said with a laugh, because it's 3 times 7. I noted in my diary at the time, if anybody ever knew how we really set the gold price through a combination of lucky numbers, etc., I think they would be really frightened. Or really upset if you're somebody like Herbert Hoover when he found out about this later. The next major act in the New Deal was the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, which established codes of conduct in terms of what could or could not take place in various industries. And this again put the federal government in the role of helping to establish prices, how much you could produce, how much the rules of distribution would be. Pretty onerous. Small businesses really had no choice. They said all of this was voluntary in the statute, but frankly, if you didn't comply, there was enormous pressure from the rest of the community to basically you either comply or they'll shut down your business. They even had symbolism associated with the NRA. It was this blue eagle emblem that they put together, and General Hugh Johnson was put in charge of the NRA, and he said, "May Almighty God have mercy on anyone who attempts to trifle with that bird." So voluntary, sure, but really, if you didn't participate, the whole community would be against you. Most people gave in. Now, by 1935, Herbert Hoover really couldn't stand this anymore. He had tried to stay quiet. He decided to start speaking out, verbally and vocally condemning some of these New Deal acts as un-American and unconstitutional. And at this point, the Supreme Court agreed. The Supreme Court of Charles Evans Hughes invalidated the AAA, the NRA, both of which they said exceeded the authority of the federal government, violated the separation of powers, the rules of federalism, the rights of the states. Hoover was pleased with this. FDR was angered by it. How dare the Supreme Court step in and say something like this? And that led Roosevelt to really his biggest political blunder of his entire 12 plus years in the White House. He tried to pack the court, to add more Supreme Court justices, frankly, so he could get more of his way. In this case, he lost this argument badly. There was a bipartisan backlash. Even Democrats were against this notion of packing the court. Herbert Hoover said, "That is not judicial process, that is force. Hands off the Supreme Court." On a rare moment, FDR backed down, but in the end, this didn't matter because time was on the side of Roosevelt. They would introduce new versions of the AAA and the NRA with slight changes here and there, but the real change was that over time, FDR got to appoint more members of the Supreme Court just by the natural attrition. In fact, by his end of his second term, he would eventually control 8 of the 9 seats on the Supreme Court. So the court was a speed bump to the New Deal, but certainly did not stop it, as eventually time would give Roosevelt more control over now all 3 branches of government. Basically a Congress doing whatever he wanted, he controlled the executive branch, and he had his people on the court. So what were the results after 4 years of FDR and the New Deal? First of all, a lot of spending. They spent more money. The debt was exploded. In fact, it doubled from Hoover's day to the end of Roosevelt's first term to now $34 billion. Large deficits in each of those areas. What result did they get? Well, they weren't very good. Unemployment in Roosevelt's first year was over 25%, higher than anything under Hoover. His first 3 years, every year for 3 years, it stayed over 20%. About 10 million people still unemployed heading into the 1936 election year. In that year, it was 17%, so it had come down a little bit, but even that 17% was higher than any year during Hoover, except Hoover's last year in office was still almost 9 million people out of work. Wages had fallen during the 4 years that Roosevelt had been in office by 43%. So the economy didn't seem to be responding to Roosevelt's New Deal that Herbert Hoover continued to say was now not only ineffective, it was un-American. As a defender of constitutional methods, Hoover wrote, of local responsibility, not centralization, of real liberty, not abetted by the glitter of radical dictatorship, regulation and not regimentation of men, the representative of sound economic thought, honest currency, and honest private initiative. This was his role as the leader of the opposition was to continue to go for those principles. What about the American people, though? The election of 1936, well, this was FDR against Alf Landon. Landon, the governor from Kansas, and the result, a landslide victory for Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, he won all but 2 states. The Electoral College was 523 to 8. Why? Well, the most effective campaign technique for Roosevelt and the Democrats was to blame Herbert Hoover. All of this was Hoover's fault. Do you want to go back to the Hoover days of the Hoover Depression and the Hoovervilles that people were living in? Now, the economic results under FDR didn't seem, frankly, to be much better. Unemployment was still way up, wages were still way down, but the country was a lot happier in the direction it seemed like with going with Franklin Roosevelt. They gave him an overwhelming re-election in 1936. The Great Depression would continue. War was on the horizon, and it was hardly happy days are here again, which was the theme song for FDR, but it's still going to be 4 more years of Roosevelt with Herbert Hoover as the leader of the opposition. And that is Herbert Hoover, the leader of the opposition, part 1 from the life of Herbert Hoover. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.